Hello students, welcome to the lecture on risk, and after the lecture we will be able to learn the following objectives. Describe history and concept of risk, define the methods of handling risk, discuss the potential risk treatments, understand the risk management plan. Let's start with risk, which is a part of every human endeavor. From the moment we get up in the morning, drive or take public transportation to get to school or to work until we get back into our beds, we are exposed to risk of different degrees. What makes the study of risk fascinating is that while some of the risk bearing may not be completely voluntary, we seek out some risk on our own and enjoy them. While some of these risks may seem trivial, others make a significant difference in the way we live our lives. It can be argued that every major advance in human civilization, from the caveman invention of tools to genes therapy, has been made possible because someone was willing to take a risk and challenge the status. We begin our exploration of risk by nothing its present through history and then look at how best to define what we mean by risk. Risk is of paramount importance to organization. Businesses must identify, evaluate, manage and report many types of risk for improved external decision making. Students, did anyone know risk category is divided into how many ways? Risk can be classified in a number of ways: business or operational, country, environmental, financial. Let us study each one of them. Business or operational, relating to activities carried out within an entity arising from structure, system, people, products or processes. Country, associated with undertaking transaction with or holding assets in a particular country. Risk might be political, economic or stem from regulatory instability. The latter might be caused by overseas taxation, repatriation of profits, nationalization or currency instability. Environmental. These risks may occur due to political, economic, socio-cultural, technological, environmental and legal chances. Financial, relating to the financial operation of an entity, and it includes credit risk. A loss may occur from the failure of another party to perform according to the terms of a contract. Currency risk, the value of a financial instrument could fluctuate due to changes in foreign exchange rates. Interest rate risk, interest rate changes could affect the financial well-being of an entity. Liquidity risk, an entity may encounter difficulty in realizing assets or otherwise raising funds to meet financial commitments.
What is risk? It may seem like a daft question, but as it turns out, there's quite a bit of confusion over what someone's thinking when they use the word risk. For instance, are they thinking about the mere possibility of something unpleasant happening, or the actual likelihood of something going horribly wrong? It's an important distinction, especially if you want to reduce or avoid risk. When everything else is stripped away, what we're talking about here is worth. What something is worth now and how it changes over time, whether it's your savings, your possessions, your livelihood, or your health. Unfortunately, it's a fact of life that bad stuff happens. Your car breaks down, you make a bad investment, you're made redundant, you get sick. And as a result, you lose something of worth. This is not good news. But there are ways of reducing the pain. You can take action, for instance, to avoid bad things happening. You can invest up front to cover future losses. Or you can take a chance and simply hope for the best. But how do you know which is the best option? Guesswork probably isn't the greatest idea, as you have no idea whether the investment you make to avoid a loss of worth is, well, worth it. What you really need is some idea of how big a potential loss of worth might be, and how much this loss can be reduced if you take a certain course of action. And this is where risk comes in. Risk, and this is my definition, is the chance of a specified loss of worth occurring. It's a number, a probability that is linked to a particular reduction in worth. Risk is not the possibility of something going wrong. Instead, it's the probability of a specific bad thing happening. And because of this, it allows the pros and cons of different risk avoidance, management, and adaptation measures to be weighed against each other.
Let us now study the history of risk. For much of human history, risk and survival have gone hand in hand. Prehistoric humans lived short and brutal lives as they searched for food and shelter, exposed to them physical danger from preying animals and poor weather. Even as more established communities developed in Sumerian, Babylon and Greece, other risks continue to ravage humanity. For much of early history, though, physical risk and material reward went hand in hand. The risk-taking caveman ended up with food, and the risk-averse one starved to death. The advent of shipping created a new forum for risk-taking for the adventurous. The Vikings embarked in superbly constructed ships from Scandinavia for Britain, Ireland, and even across the Atlantic to the Americas in search of new lands to plunder the risk-return trade-off of their age. The development of the shipping trades created fresh equation for risk and return, with the risk of ships sinking and being waylaid by pirates offset by the reward from ships that made it back with cargo. It also allowed for the separation of physical from economic risk, as wealthy traders bet their money while the poor risked their lives on the ships. The spice trade that flourished as early as 350 BC but expanded and became the basic for empires in the middle of the last millennium provides a good example. Moving on further, let's talk about the definition of risk. Given the ubiquity of risk in almost every human activity, it is surprising how little consensus there is about how to define risk. The early discussions centered on the distinction between risk that could be quantified objectively and subjective risk. Uncertainty must be taken in a sense radically distinct from the familiar notion of risk, from which it has never been properly separated. The essential fact is the risk means, in some cases, a quantity susceptible of measurement, while at other times it is something distinctly not of this character. And there are far-reaching and crucial differences in the bearings of the phenomena, depending on which of the two is really present and operating. It will appear that a measurable uncertainty or risk proper, as we shall use the term, is so far different from an unmeasurable one that it is not, in effect, an uncertainty at all. The emphasis on whether uncertainty is subjective or objective seems to us misplaced. It is true that risk that is measurable is easier to ensure, but we do care about all uncertainty, whether measurable or not. There are two ingredients that are needed for risk to exist. Risk is incorporated into so many different disciplines, from insurance to engineering to portfolio theory, that it should come as no surprise that it is defined in different ways by each one. It is worth looking at some of the distinction. Risk versus probability, risk versus threat, all outcomes versus negative outcomes. Now let us understand these terms. Risk versus probability. While some definition of risk focus only on the probability of an event occurring, more comprehensive definition incorporate both the probability of the event occurring and the consequences of the event. Thus, the probability of a severe earthquake may be very small, but the consequences are so catastrophic that it would be categorized as a high-risk event. Risk versus threat. In some discipline, a contrast is drawn between risk and a threat. A threat is a low probability event with very large negative consequences, where analysts may be unable to assess the probability. A risk, on the other hand, is defined to be a higher probability event, where there is enough information to make assessment of both the probability and the consequences. All outcomes versus negative outcomes. Some definition of risk tend to focus only on the downside scenarios, whereas others are more expansive and consider all variability as risk. The engineering definition of risk is defined as a product of the probability of an event occurring that is viewed as undesirable and an assessment of the expected harm from the event occurring. Risk is equal to probability of an accident, consequences in lost money or debts. In contrast, risk in finance is defined in terms of variability of actual returns on an investment around an expected return, even when those returns represent positive outcomes. Risk versus uncertainty. Many people think that risk simply means that a return on investment is uncertain. While that is true, and the concept of risk and the concept of uncertainty are similar, they are entirely different concepts. Risk is the ideology that there may be consequences to action. In finance, the term risk is used frequently to describe the likelihood that an investor will lose money on an investment. There are two types of financial risk: systematic risk, unsystematic risk. Now let us find about them. Systematic risk is associated with the economy as a whole, the business cycle and specific industries. Unsystematic risk is risk that is specific to a company. Unsystematic risk is caused by factors that affect only the company, such as increased competition, weather, damage, or an employee strike. This type of risk can be virtually eliminated if the investor diversifies or has variety in his portfolio, according to James Bradfield, author of Introduction to the Economics of Financial Markets.
We all know that all investments have risk, so it's safe to assume that all stocks have risk as well, right? But did you know that there were different types of risk? Not all risk is the same. So most people think that all risk is the same, but it's not true. There are some risks that you can avoid via diversification, and we'll talk about those. And then other types of risks which are 100% completely unavoidable. I bet you didn't hear anyone say that recently, that you can completely have a risk that is 100% unavoidable, meaning you can't hedge it, you can't get rid of it, it's always there. So that is systematic risk. Systematic risk is due to risk factors that affect the entire market, such as investment policy changes, foreign investment policy, taxation, shift in social economic parameters, global security threats, etc. For example, Black Monday on October 19th, 1987, was a systematic event in that almost all stocks fell in value on that single day. We could also say that a systematic event was 9/11, right? No one had ever factored in the fact that two planes would fly into the World Trade Center, into the Pentagon, would crash in Pennsylvania. No one ever knew that. That's a risk that is unavoidable, and it affects the entire market. So this type of risk, the systematic risk, is beyond the control of investors. Me or you or anybody, we can't control this, and it cannot be mitigated. Now we have unsystematic risk. Now, unsystematic risk is due to factors specific to an industry or a company, like product category, research and development, pricing, and marketing strategy. So if you owned one stock and if that company went bankrupt, you'd lose 100% of your portfolio, right? But what if you owned 100 stocks and that one company still went bankrupt? You would only have lost 1% of your portfolio. So you can see that this type of risk is completely is avoidable, not unavoidable. Yet the market does compensate investors for taking such exposure. I would say that unsystematic risk would be risk if you're in, let's say, the aerospace industry or the cotton industry, or you're in the electronics industry or the computer industry or the oil and natural gas industry. Those all have risks in and of themselves that are different than every other industry out there. Now you can get rid of that risk and avoid some of that risk via diversification, buying a whole bunch of different securities that are not related to one another in any way, shape, or form, or have minimal relation between them. And that's how you avoid that. In portfolio theory, what we really talk about here is the fact that the more number of securities you have in a portfolio, generally speaking, now there is a max, and that's called the efficient frontier, which we will talk about in another video. But generally speaking, the more number of securities or the more stocks you hold in a portfolio, the less unsystematic risk you're going to have in that portfolio. And you can see how this unsystematic risk feature here is going to decrease. Now, risk is measured up and down on this sidebar here. And so there's a certain level of systematic risk which is always present, and that's marked here by this A to B line. And you can see that this systematic risk is always present, and it's present no matter how many securities we have in the portfolio. We could have the most diversified portfolio on earth, but that still doesn't change the fact that on 9/11, two planes hit the World Trade Center, and that terrorist attack was something that was completely unavoidable. No one knew that was coming. But for unsystematic risk, which is just specific to different industries and companies, you can avoid that risk and reduce your risk by diversifying the number of stocks you have, the industry, the sector, the country, etc. So generally speaking, the more you have, the closer you're going to get to just pure systematic risk, and that is always a good thing, right? You want to reduce as much risk in your portfolio as possible.
Uncertainty is a state where the current conditions are unknown. In decision making, accurate probabilities cannot be given to the variables involved in making the decision. In other words, we cannot say that given A, B, and C, we would make a certain decision because we do not have a true picture of what A, B, and C are, what they represent according to Business Dictionary. Now, uncertainty principle is a controversial principle in quantum mechanics and physics. Both risk and uncertainty are concepts involving the unknown. Both concepts cause fear and anxiety. If not taken into consideration, both concepts can have devastating consequences to an investor. If the investor takes too large of a risk, he may lose money. At the same time, if the investor closes his eyes and points at stock to invest in, thus being uncertain of what he is choosing, he may also lose money. Risk involves an unknown future, while uncertainty involves an unknown present. In other words, we are taking a risk when we know all of the variables depict a dangerous situation and we act anyway. When we are uncertain, we do not know all of the variables. In finance, there are two types of risk. Operational risk has been defined by the Basel Community on Banking Supervision as the risk of loss resulting from inadequate or failed internal processes, people and system, or from external events. The committee wants to enhance operational risk assessment efforts by encouraging the industry to develop methodologies and collect data related to managing operational risk. Consequently, the scope of the framework presented in this chapter focuses primarily upon the operational risk component of other risks and encourages the industry to further develop techniques for measuring, monitoring, and mitigating operational risk. In framing the current proposal, the committee has adopted a common industry definition of operational risk, namely, the risk of direct or indirect loss resulting from inadequate or failed internal processes, people and systems, or from external events. Strategic and reputational risk is not included in this definition for the purpose of a minimum regulatory operational risk capital charge. This definition focuses on the causes of operational risk, and the committee believes that this is appropriate for both risk management and ultimately measurement. As stated in its definition of operational risk, the committee intends for the capital framework to shield institutions from both direct and certain indirect losses. At this stage, the committee is unable to prescribe finally the scope of the charge in this respect. However, it is intended that the cost to fix an operational risk problem, payments to third parties, and write-down generally would be included in calculating the loss incurred from the operational risk event. Furthermore, there may be other types of losses or events which should be reflected in the charge, such as near misses, latent losses, or contingent losses. Further analysis is needed on whether and how to address these events or losses. The cost of improvement in controls, preventative action, and quality assurance and investment in new system would not be included. In line with other banking risks, conceptually, a capital charge for operational risk should cover unexpected losses due to operational risk. Provision should cover expected losses. However, accounting rules in many countries do not appear to allow a robust, comprehensive, and clear approach to setting provisions, especially for operational risk. Interest rate risk, IRR, is the exposure of an institution's financial condition to adverse movement in interest rate. Accepting this risk is a normal part of banking and can be an important source of profitability and shareholder value. However, excessive level of IRR can pose a significant threat to an institution's earnings and capital base. Credit risk is risk due to uncertainty in a counterparty's, also called an obligor's or credit's, ability to meet its financial obligation, because there are many types of counterparties from individual to sovereign, governments, and many different types of obligation from auto loans to derivatives. Transaction credit risk takes many forms, Institutions manage it in different ways. In assessing credit risk from a single counterparty, an institution must consider three issues. Default probability. What is the likelihood that the counterparty will default on its obligation either over the life of the obligation or over some specific horizon, such as a year? Calculated for a 1-year horizon, this may be called the expected default frequency. Credit exposure. In the event of a default, how large will the outstanding obligation be when the default occurs? Recovery rate. In the event of a default, what fraction of the exposure may be recovered through bankruptcy proceeding or some other form of settlement? When we speak of the credit quality of an obligation, this refers generally to the counterparty's ability to perform on that obligation. This encompasses both the obligation default probability and anticipated recovery rate. Business risk. Business risk is the chance that a business cash flows are insufficient to cover operating expenses. Operating expenses are those a business incurs by performing its normal operation. They include wages, rent, repairs, taxes, transportation, and other selling, administrative, and general expenses. Without adequate cash flow to pay for these expenses, business become more likely to fail. Business's risk refers to the likelihood of this occurring and is further divided into two types: systematic risk and unsystematic risk. Pure risk is a term that is applied to any situation where there is no potential for any benefit to be realized if a specific outcome should result. Typically, events that are considered to carry this level of risk are out of the control of the individual who is assuming the risk, making it impossible to actually make a conscious decision to take on the risk. Insurance is often utilized as a means of minimizing losses from risk of this type, a factor that can offset the fact that no actual gains can be realized from the situation. Did you know? The scientific approach to risk entered finance in the 1960s with the advent of the capital asset pricing model and became increasingly important in the 1980s when financial derivatives proliferated. Moving on further, let's talk about the methods of handling risk. Risk is the possibility of a loss. People, organization, and society usually try to avoid risk, or if not avoidable, then do manage it somehow. There are 5 major methods of handling risk: avoidance, loss control, retention, non-insurance transfer, insurance. Avoidance is the elimination of risk. We can avoid the risk of a loss in the stock market by not buying or shorting stocks. The risk of a venereal disease can be avoided by not having sex, or the risk of divorce by not marrying, the risk of having car trouble by not having a car. Many manufacturers avoid legal risk by not manufacturing particular products. Loss control works by either loss prevention, which involves reducing the probability of risk, or loss reduction, which minimizes the loss. Risk retention is handling the unavoidable or unvoiced risk internally, either because insurance cannot be purchased or it is too expensive for the risk, or because it is much more cost effective to handle the risk internally. Non-insurance transfer of risk. The 3 major forms of non-insurance risk transfer are by contract, hedging, and for business risk by incorporating. A common way to transfer risk by a contract is by purchasing the warranty extension that many retailers sell for the items that they sell. The warranty itself transfers the risk of manufacturing defects the buyers to the manufacturer. Transfer of risk through contract is often accomplished or prevented by a hold harmless clause, which may limit a liability for the party to which the clause applies. Insurance is another major method that most people, businesses, and other organizations can use to transfer pure risk by paying a premium to an insurance company in exchange for a payment of a possible large loss. By using the law of large numbers, an insurance company can estimate fairly reliable the amount of loss for a given number of customers within a specific time. Let's move ahead and talk about the potential risk treatment. A risk treatment is mandatorily a part of an effective risk management plan. The plan here means how we respond to the reported potential risks. It details on strategies on how to deal with the various risks, low or high, acceptable or unacceptable. The plan also outlines the role and responsibilities of the team members. Risk response planning. Risk response planning, no doubt, is an integral aspect of risk treatment. The planning covers, discusses, and evaluates inputs like risk register, risk profiles, and cost control matters. Strategies are formulated and documented in this stage. Risk management plan. Select appropriate controls or countermeasures to measure each risk. Risk mitigation needs to be approved by the appropriate level of management. For example, a risk concerning the image of the organization should have top management decision behind it, whereas IT management would have the authority to decide on computer virus risk. The risk management plan should propose applicable and effective security controls for managing the risk. For example, and observed a high risk of computer viruses could be mitigated by acquiring and implementing antivirus software. A good risk management plan should contain a schedule for control implementation and responsible person for those actions. Now, in the end, let us summarize what we have learned in this lecture. Interest rate risk (IRR) is the exposure of an institution financial condition to adverse movement in interest rates. Risk response planning, no doubt, is an integral aspect of risk treatment. Risk analysis involves the consideration of the source of risk, the consequence, and likelihood to estimate the inherent or unprotected risk without controls in place. Business risk is the change that a business cash flows are insufficient to cover operating expenses. Risk treatment, also known as risk control, is that part of the risk management where decisions are made about how to deal with risk either in the external or internal environment. Various actions like risk reduction, risk avoidance, risk acceptance, and risk transfer.